I never thought I'd be standing outside a church, peering through a stained glass window like some stranger, watching my husband's funeral unfold without me. But there I was, Eleanor Thompson, Ellie to those who know me, 68 years old, clutching my worn leather purse, my hands trembling so hard I could barely hold it steady. Tears burned my cheeks as I stood on the cold sidewalk outside St. Paul's Church in our little Oregon town. Inside, my daughter Rachel, my only child, was accepting condolences that should have been mine to receive. Her husband Mark stood beside her, his arm around her like he was the grieving son-in-law of the year. The sight of it, their performance, made my chest ache so fiercely. I thought I might collapse right there. "You can't come in, Mom," Rachel had said that morning, her voice sharp as a blade, her eyes refusing to meet mine. "You don't deserve to be here after everything you put Dad through." Those words, they hit me like a slap. So cold, so final, I couldn't even find my voice to argue. My own daughter, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep, the one I'd taught to tie her shoes, was standing on the church steps, barring me from saying goodbye to George, my husband of 42 years. What had I put George through? The accusation was so absurd, so cruel, it felt like a bad dream. George and I, we weren't perfect. No couple is after 4 decades, but we loved each other deeply. We'd built a life together, starting with nothing but a tiny apartment and big dreams. George was a carpenter, a man who could turn a piece of wood into something beautiful. Whether it was a dining table or a rocking chair for our porch, we'd weathered hard times, the lean years when I was still teaching 3rd graders and he was taking on odd jobs. The nights we stayed up worrying about bills, but we'd also celebrated the good times: family picnics by the river, vacations to the coast, quiet evenings with a glass of wine and his favorite jazz records spinning. How could Rachel twist that love into something ugly? I stood there, the September wind cutting through my black coat, watching people file into the church, neighbors we'd known for years, parents from Rachel's old school, folks from George's woodworking club. They all glanced my way, some with confusion, others with pity they tried to hide. Mrs. Callahan, our neighbor who always brought us zucchini from her garden, started to walk toward me, her face soft with concern. But before she could reach me, Mark swooped in, all charm and fake grief, whispering something in her ear. She froze, gave me a sad look, then let him guide her. Inside, I could have screamed, but what good would it have done? Rachel stood tall in her sleek black dress, Mark at her side, his hand on her shoulder like he was protecting her from me. "From me, Rachel, please," I'd begged earlier, my voice cracking like brittle glass. "He was my husband. I have every right to be there." "You lost that right years ago," she snapped, still not looking at me. "Dad told me things, Mom, about how you made his life harder than it needed to be." Her words felt like a knife twisting in my gut. George would never have said those things. They weren't true. But Rachel believed them, or at least she wanted to. I saw the way Mark leaned in, murmuring something to her, his lips curled, in that smug little smile he always wore when he thought he'd won. I realized then that this wasn't just Rachel. Mark had been working on her, probably for years, planting doubts, spinning lies, and I'd been too busy caring for George in his final days to see it coming. Through the church window, I caught glimpses of the service. The organ played hymns George and I used to sing together on Sundays, back when life felt simpler. Rachel stood at the podium, delivering what I'm sure was a polished eulogy, her voice steady, her face the picture of grief. People nodded, dabbed their eyes with tissues. It looked like the kind of farewell George deserved, thoughtful, dignified, full of love. Except I wasn't part of it. I was an outsider, pressed against a tree to stay out of sight, my coat pulled tight against the chill. I thought about the nights I'd spent by George's bedside when his lungs started failing, the way I'd organized his medications, driven him to every doctor's appointment, held his hand when the pain kept him awake. I'd read him passages from his favorite mystery novels, my voice soft to soothe him to sleep. I'd helped him keep his pride, even when the illness stripped away his strength. None of that mattered to Rachel. In her mind, I was the villain, the one who'd somehow failed her father. As the service ended, I watched the pallbearers, Rachel's husband, Mark, and 5 of George's old friends, carry the casket to the hearse. Rachel climbed into the lead car, playing the role of chief mourner, a role that should have been mine. Mark glanced my way as they drove past, his eyes cold, triumphant. I didn't follow them to the cemetery. I couldn't bear to stand on the sidelines again. watching from a distance as they lowered George into the ground. Instead, I drove back to our house, the house George and I had filled with laughter, arguments, and love for 30 years. It still smelled like him, like sawdust from his workshop and the peppermint tea he drank every night. I sat in his favorite armchair, the one he'd reupholstered himself, and let the tears come until I had none left. But even in that grief, something else was stirring inside me. A quiet strength, a spark I didn't know I had. Rachel thought she could erase me from George's life, rewrite our story to make me the bad guy. She was wrong. George had always been a careful man, thoughtful in everything he did. As I sat there, his voice echoed in my mind, soft but clear, from one of our last conversations. "Ellie," he'd whispered, his hand weak in mine, "I've made sure you'll be okay. Rachel doesn't know everything." At the time, I thought he was talking about money, about bills. But now, with the sting of Rachel's words still fresh, I wondered if he'd known something I didn't. Had he seen this coming? Had he known Rachel would try to push me out? I'm Ellie Thompson, and this is my story. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you loved, you'll understand what comes next. Stick with me until the end, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see how far my story reaches. That week after George's funeral felt like walking through fog. Everything was heavy, muted, like the world had lost its color. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for George's hand, only to find the cold side of the bed where he used to sleep. The house was too quiet without his soft humming or the clink of his tools in the workshop out back, but Rachel's words, "You don't deserve to be here," echoed louder than the silence. They clung to me, sharp and relentless, cutting deeper every time I replayed them. How could my own daughter, the baby I'd sung lullabies to, look at me like I was nothing? I kept thinking about George, about the man who'd carved our initials into a cedar bench on our 10th anniversary, who'd laugh so hard at my bad cooking that he'd have to wipe tears from his eyes. We'd had our fights, sure, like the time I insisted on painting the kitchen yellow, and he grumbled for weeks about it looking like a lemon exploded. But we always found our way back to each other. The idea that I'd made his life miserable, like Rachel claimed, was a lie so big it didn't even fit in my head. And yet, she believed it. Or maybe she wanted to believe it, with Mark whispering in her ear, steering her like she was a car he could drive wherever he pleased. I was watering George's rosebushes in the backyard. He'd always been so proud of them, pruning them like they were his children. When my phone rang, Rachel's name flashed on the screen, and my stomach twisted. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Her voice was all business, cold as the wind that day at the church. "Mom, we're having a meeting about Dad's estate, tomorrow at 2 o'clock, at the house. Bring any financial papers you have. We need to sort this out properly." The way she said properly made my skin crawl. Like I'd been mishandling things all these years. Like I hadn't balanced our checkbook or paid the bills while George was sick. I wanted to snap back, to tell her this was my home, my life with George. But all I managed was a quiet, "I'll be there." After I hung up, I stood there, staring at those roses, their petals curling in the autumn chill. George's voice drifted back to me, faint but clear, from one of those last nights when the pain kept him awake. "Ellie," he'd said, his hand squeezing mine, "I've made sure you'll be okay. Rachel doesn't know everything." At the time, I thought he was just reassuring me about money, about the mortgage or his pension. But now, with Rachel's coldness ringing in my ears, those words felt heavier, like they carried a secret I hadn't yet uncovered. What didn't Rachel know? What had George done to make sure I'd be okay? That night, I couldn't sleep. I went to George's workshop, where his tools still hung neatly on the pegboard, his sketches for a birdhouse still pinned to the wall. I sat at his desk, running my fingers over the worn wood, and started opening drawers. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe just a piece of him to hold on to. That's when I found it. A small card tucked under a stack of old receipts. Margaret Reynolds, attorney at law. The name didn't ring a bell. George had always used a family lawyer, Henry Larson, for things like our mortgage or his business permits. But this card was different, personal, with a handwritten note on the back in George's careful script. "For Ellie, if you need her." My heart started pounding. Why would George keep a lawyer's name hidden like that? I sat there in the dim light of his workshop, the smell of sawdust wrapping around me like a hug, and I knew I had to call her. The next morning, I dialed the number with shaking fingers. A warm voice answered, "Margaret Reynolds' office." I stumbled over my words, explaining who I was, mentioning George. The secretary's tone softened immediately. Mrs. Thompson, we've been expecting your call. Can you come in today? Expecting my call? The words sent a shiver through me, but not the bad kind. It was like a tiny spark of hope flickering in the dark. I drove to Maggie Reynolds' office in downtown Portland, a small brick building with ivy climbing the walls. Maggie was about my age, maybe 65, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you. She greeted me with a handshake that was firm but kind, like she already knew what I'd been through. Ellie, she said, settling into her chair, I'm so sorry about George. He was a good man, and he loved you fiercely. Her words brought tears to my eyes, not just because they were true, but because someone was finally acknowledging the love George and I shared. I nodded, unable to speak, and she continued. George came to see me several times over the past 2 years. He was worried about some family dynamics. Family dynamics. That was a polite way to say it. I swallowed hard, my voice barely a whisper. Did he know about Rachel and Mark? Maggie's eyes softened, but there was a steel in her voice. George knew more than they thought. He saw how Rachel was pulling away, how Mark was feeding her lies about you. They tried to convince him you weren't capable of handling things, that you were forgetful, unreliable, even neglectful, toward him in his final years. I gasped, my hand flying to my chest. Neglectful. I was with George every day. I drove him to every appointment, made sure he had his meds, read to him when he couldn't sleep. My voice broke, and Maggie reached across her desk, her hand resting gently on mine. He knew that, Ellie, and he made sure to protect you. She pulled a file from her drawer, thick with papers. George was meticulous. He documented everything, conversations, emails, even text messages between Rachel and Mark. They were trying to make him believe you weren't fit to manage your own life, let alone his estate. They suggested you might have early dementia, that you couldn't be trusted with money. Dementia, the word hit me like a punch. I remembered little moments, Rachel asking if I'd forgotten where I parked the car, Mark commenting on how I'd misplaced my glasses once or twice. I thought they were just being overly concerned. But now, it all made sense. They'd been building a case against me, piece by piece, while I was too busy caring for George to notice. George didn't believe them, Maggie said, her voice steady. Not for a second. And he took steps to make sure their lies wouldn't hurt you after he was gone. I sat there, stunned, as the weight of her words settled in. George had seen through Rachel and Mark's manipulation. He'd known they were trying to push me out, to rewrite our life together, and he'd done something about it. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something shift inside me. Not just grief, but a quiet, burning resolve. Rachel thought she could erase me from George's legacy, humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. She was wrong. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that inheritance meeting, into the house George and I had built together. Rachel and Mark might think they were in control, but George had left me something. Not just money, not just a house, but a way to fight back. I just didn't know the full extent of it yet. The morning of the inheritance meeting, I woke up with a knot in my stomach, like I was heading into a storm I couldn't avoid. I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the navy dress George always said made my eyes look like the ocean. I wanted to walk into that house, our house, with my head high, even if Rachel and Mark were waiting to tear me down again. I tucked Maggie Reynolds' card into my purse, her words from yesterday echoing in my mind. George made sure to protect you. I didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but it was enough to keep my hands steady as I drove to the house I'd called home for 30 years. When I pulled into the driveway, Rachel's sleek sedan was parked next to Mark's polished SUV, both gleaming like they were trying to outshine the faded paint of our old craftsman house. Another car, a gray sedan, sat nearby, probably their lawyers. I let myself in with my key, calling out softly, "Hello, it's me." My voice sounded small in the foyer, like I was a guest in my own home. Rachel's voice came from the dining room, sharp and impatient. "In here, Mom." I walked in, clutching my purse, and froze. The dining room, where George and I had hosted countless Thanksgiving dinners, where we'd laughed over Rachel's childhood drawings, felt like a courtroom now. Rachel sat at the head of the table, George's place, papers spread out in front of her like she was running a board meeting. Mark sat to her right, his tie perfectly knotted, his face a mask of smug confidence. To her left was a man, I didn't know, middle-aged, with a briefcase and a nervous smile. This is Henry Larson, Rachel said, not bothering to look up. Dad's lawyer. He's here to go over the will. I moved toward my usual chair, the one I'd sat in for decades of family meals, but Rachel's voice stopped me cold. Actually, Mom, this meeting is for immediate family with a stake in Dad's estate. I stood there, my hand on the chair's back, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. I'm sorry, what? Mark leaned forward, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. What Rachel means is, this is for people who actually have a claim to George's legacy. You've got your pension, your savings. We're here to handle the real responsibilities. Real responsibilities. As if caring for George through every cough, every sleepless night, every hospital visit wasn't responsibility enough. I looked at Rachel, searching for a trace of the little girl who used to climb into my lap for bedtime stories. But her eyes were hard, fixed on the papers in front of her. Rachel, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, George was my husband. I belong here. Her jaw tightened. You made Dad's life harder than it needed to be, Mom. You controlled everything. His time, his friends, even his relationship with me. Did you think I didn't notice? Each word felt like a stone thrown at my chest. None of it was true, but the way she said it, with such conviction, made me wonder if she truly believed I'd been some kind of tyrant. Mark's hand rested on hers, a silent signal of support, and I saw it then, the way he was steering this, orchestrating every move. Rachel, that's not I started, but she cut me off. This table is for people Dad actually trusted, she said, her voice like ice. People who deserve to be here. You should go. I stood there, clutching my purse, feeling smaller than I ever had in my 68 years. Henry Larson shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing. I wanted to scream, to demand they listen, but my legs felt like they might give out. Rachel, I said one last time, my voice breaking. Please. Goodbye, Mom, she said, turning back to her papers like I was already gone. I walked out of that dining room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. George had sanded himself. Behind me, I heard the murmur of their voices, the rustle of papers, as if they were already dividing up George's life without me. I made it to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared at the house through blurry eyes. But something was shifting inside me, like a tide turning. Rachel thought she could erase me, humiliate me, and I'd just take it. She was wrong. George's words kept circling in my mind. Rachel doesn't know everything. I pulled out my phone and dialed Maggie Reynolds' office. It's Ellie Thompson, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I need to see you, now. Maggie's office felt like a safe harbor after the storm of that meeting. She welcomed me with a warm smile, her silver hair catching the light as she gestured to a leather chair across from her desk. Ellie, she said, her voice full of quiet strength, I was hoping you'd call after that meeting. Tell me what happened. I poured it all out, Rachel's accusations, Mark's smugness, the way they'd pushed me out of my own home. Maggie listened, nodding, her face calm but her eyes sharp. When I finished, she leaned back, folding her hands. George saw this coming, she said. He knew Rachel and Mark were planning to cut you out, and he made sure they wouldn't succeed. My breath caught. What do you mean? She opened a file, pulling out a stack of documents and a small USB drive. George was meticulous. About 2 years ago, he noticed Rachel pulling away. Mark was always there, asking questions about his health, your marriage, the finances. They started suggesting you were slipping, forgetting things, making bad decisions. They even told George you might need a guardian to manage your affairs after he was gone. I felt sick, my hands gripping the arms of the chair. A guardian. I'm not some helpless old woman. I managed our budget, George's medications, everything. George knew that, Maggie said, her voice firm. He never doubted you, but he played along, letting them think he was buying their story. Meanwhile, he was gathering evidence. She tapped the USB drive, recordings of phone calls where Mark suggested you weren't fit to inherit, text messages where Rachel called you a burden and planned to take control of the estate. And this, she slid a document across the desk, is George's real will. Signed 3 months before he died, witnessed and notarized. I stared at the document, my heart racing. What does it say? Maggie's eyes softened, but her voice held a hint of triumph. George left everything to you, the house, his savings, the workshop, even his old truck. Rachel gets $5,000, but only if she doesn't interfere with you. If she tries to contest the will or harass you, that money goes straight to the local hospice where George volunteered. I couldn't speak. George had known. He'd seen through Rachel and Mark's lies, their scheming. He'd protected me, even when he was too weak to sit up in bed. Tears welled up, but they weren't just from grief, they were from gratitude, from the overwhelming love I felt for the man who'd always had my back. "There's more," Maggie said, her tone turning serious. "George left a letter for you, and one for Rachel. He wanted her to face the truth about what she's done. He also left something else, a recording. He made it a month before he passed, when he knew what they were planning for his funeral, a recording." The words sent a chill through me. "What's on it?" Maggie shook her head. "You'll hear it at the right time." George was specific. He wanted Rachel and Mark to show their true colors before we reveal everything. He wanted you to see exactly who they are. I nodded, my mind spinning. George had always been careful, thoughtful, the kind of man who measured twice before cutting once. He'd planned this, not out of spite, but to protect me, to give me the dignity Rachel tried to take away. "Rachel called another meeting next week," Maggie said, her eyes gleaming. "She thinks she's in control, that Henry Larson's will is the final word. But we'll be there, Ellie, and we'll show them George's real wishes." As I left Maggie's office, I felt something I hadn't felt since George's diagnosis, a spark of anticipation, not dread. Rachel and Mark thought they'd won, thought they could rewrite my life with George. But George had seen through them, and soon they'd see it too. The week before the second inheritance meeting felt like standing on the edge of something new, something I hadn't dared imagine since George got sick. I spent those days in a strange sort of calm, like the quiet before a sunrise. Rachel's betrayal still stung, sharp and raw, but Maggie's words and George's planning gave me a strength I didn't know I had left. George had seen through our daughter, seen the way Mark twisted her into someone I barely recognized, and he'd made sure I wouldn't be left defenseless. The meeting was set for a Friday, exactly 2 weeks after George's funeral. Maggie's office called Rachel, Mark, and their lawyer, Henry Larson, citing discrepancies in the estate papers. I could imagine Rachel's irritation, Mark's smug confidence that they'd still come out on top. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a soft green sweater George always loved. He said it reminded him of the forest we'd hike through on our anniversaries. I wanted to walk into this meeting as Ellie Thompson, not the broken woman Rachel had tried to make me. When I arrived at our house, my house, Rachel's sedan and Mark's SUV were already in the driveway, alongside Henry's gray sedan, and a new car I didn't recognize. I used my key one last time, feeling the weight of it in my hand, knowing this might be the final moment I'd cross this threshold as its owner. Inside, Rachel was pacing the living room, her face flushed with annoyance. Mark sat on the couch, his arms crossed, looking like a man who thought he'd already won. Henry stood by the window, fidgeting with his tie. "What's this about, Mom?" Rachel snapped as soon as she saw me. "Some lawyer claiming there's a problem with Dad's will. Did you put her up to this?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Maggie Reynolds walked in, her silver hair gleaming under the chandelier, carrying a leather briefcase. Behind her was a young woman with a court reporter's machine, her face calm and professional. "Good afternoon," Maggie said, her voice steady but warm. "I'm Margaret Reynolds, George Thompson's personal attorney for the past 10 years. This is Ms. Laura Bennett, who will be documenting today's proceedings." Henry Larson's face twisted in confusion. "I don't understand. I'm George's lawyer. I handled his will 6 months ago." Maggie's smile was polite but firm. "You handled a will, Mr. Larson. George kept his most important documents with me." The room went quiet, except for the soft click of Laura setting up her equipment. Rachel's eyes narrowed, and Mark leaned forward, his jaw tight. "What are you talking about?" Rachel asked, her voice sharp. Maggie opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick document bound in blue. "I'm talking about George's true, last will and testament, signed 3 months before his death, properly witnessed and notarized." She looked around the room, her gaze steady. George was specific. He wanted certain behaviors to be fully revealed before his wishes were made clear. Rachel sank into a chair, her face pale. Mark's confidence faltered, his eyes darting. To Henry, "That's impossible," he said. "George showed us the will. We went over everything. Maggie's expression didn't waver. George told me about those conversations. He also told me about your suggestions that Ellie was unfit, claims about her memory, her ability to manage finances. He documented every word. She held up a USB drive, small but heavy with truth. Recordings of phone calls where you, Mark, suggested Ellie needed a guardian. Text messages where you, Rachel, called your mother a burden and planned to take control of the estate. Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came out. Mark's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists. Maggie cleared her throat and began reading. To my daughter Rachel, who has shown her true character in my final years, I leave $5,000, provided she respects her mother's rights. Any attempt to contest this will, or harass Ellie, will result in that sum being donated to the hospice where I volunteered. The silence was deafening. Rachel stared at the table, her hands trembling. Mark sputtered, "This can't be legal." "A daughter has rights. In this state," Maggie said calmly, "a person can distribute their assets as they see fit, provided they're of sound mind." George had 2 independent medical evaluations to ensure his wishes couldn't be challenged. He was clear-headed until the end. She turned to the next page. "The remainder of my estate, the house, my savings, my workshop, and all personal property, goes to my beloved wife, Ellie, who stood by me for 42 years and deserved better than the treatment she received from our daughter." I felt the room spin, my heart swelling with love and grief. George had left me everything, not just the house, but his trust, his love, his belief in me. Maggie wasn't done. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice softening. "George left letters, one for Ellie, one for Rachel, and a recording." She plugged the USB into a small speaker on the table. George's voice filled the room, weak but unmistakable. "Rachel," he said, "I know what you and Mark have been planning. I know you kept Ellie from my funeral, thinking you could erase her from our life. I know about the lies you told, the way you tried to make me doubt her. I'm disappointed, but I'm not surprised. I raised you to be better, but you made your choices." Rachel's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mark stared at the floor, his bravado gone. George's voice continued, steady and firm. "Ellie, I love you more than I ever found words to say. I'm sorry I couldn't stop this while I was alive, but I've made sure you'll be okay. Live the life we dreamed of, Ellie. You've earned it." The recording ended, and I clutched the letter Maggie handed me, my hands shaking. Rachel's letter sat unopened in her lap, her sobs the only sound in the room. Maggie packed her briefcase with the same care George used to show in his workshop. "Ellie, we'll settle the estate next week. Rachel, Mark, I suggest you respect George's wishes." As I walked out, Rachel looked at me, her eyes red. "Mom," she started, but I raised a hand. "Goodbye, Rachel," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "I hope you find the person you used to be." 3 months later, I stood in the empty living room of our old house, watching a moving truck pull away. I'd sold it to a young family with 2 little boys, who'd already started playing in the backyard where George's roses still bloomed. It felt right, like the house deserved new laughter, new memories. Rachel had tried to contact me, calls, texts, even a letter through her lawyer, threatening to contest the will. Each attempt grew more desperate, but when she filed papers, the $5,000 went to the hospice, just as George promised. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I moved to Maple Grove, a senior living community 30 miles away, with gardens and a photography club that met every Thursday. I'd always loved taking pictures, but life, raising Rachel, teaching, caring for George, had pushed that passion aside. Now, I was learning to capture sunsets, wildflowers, the way light danced on the river. I signed up for a trip to Alaska to see the northern lights, something George and I had planned but never done. One afternoon, a young woman from the Maple Grove newsletter, Sarah, asked to interview me. Sitting on my balcony, sipping chamomile tea, I told her my story. Not all of it, but enough. "I lost my husband," I said, "and I learned family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up for you, who sees you. I'm starting over at 68, and I'm not afraid anymore." She asked what advice I'd give others. I thought of George's letter, still tucked in my nightstand, his words urging me to live. "Don't let anyone tell you your story's over," I said. "You can start again, at any age, if you're brave enough to choose yourself." That night, I stood on my balcony, watching the stars over Maple Grove. My phone buzzed, another text from Rachel, begging to talk. I deleted it, my heart steady. George had given me more than an inheritance. He'd given me the truth, and with it, the freedom to live for me. In 3 weeks, I'd be on a ship in Alaska, watching the northern lights paint the sky. I raised my tea to George, to the life we'd shared, and to the one I was building now. This is my story, but I want to hear yours. Have you ever had to start over after a betrayal? Share below, and let me know where you're watching from. Sometimes, the end of one chapter is just the beginning of something beautiful.